Hi, my name's Tom Mayers, and I'm a resident of Longboat Key, a lifetime resident. My family's lived in the Tampa Bay area for the past 100 years or more. My great uncle was the founder of Tampa Yacht Club and was on the Tampa City Council for 3 years in 1885 in that period. And he had the first passenger carrying boat that came to Sarasota on a regular basis. I went to New College and got my degree in the area of environmental studies, and worked for the past 35 years as an environmental specialist, working with people to trim mangroves and remove exotic vegetation, working with developers and homeowners. With my degree in environmental studies, I've always had an interest in this area, and I would like to talk to you about the Longboat Key, the barrier island, with a consideration of the plant and animal history on Longboat Key. The Longboat Key is a barrier island and has been in the present location for probably the last 1,000 years or less. When you talk about barrier islands on the west coast of Florida, you have to consider that Longboat Key and other barrier islands, Siesta Key, Anna Maria Island, and anywhere on the coast of Florida, that there's been sea level rise. And with the glaciers melting in the last ice age, it happened about 20,000 years ago, and since then the sea level has been rising gradually. So if you were to estimate the sea level about 10,000 years ago, it would be 100 feet, or about 100 feet lower than it is today. So when you consider these islands, you have to consider them as sort of transient, ephemeral landforms that aren't like mountains that have been in a place for millions of years. So in this consideration, I'm trying to show you using aerial photographs and photographs of the plants and animals what has happened here on Longboat Key. So in your lifetime, if you've been here for 50 years, you've seen a sea level rise of probably about 6 inches. So this has a lot to do with erosion, and you go back 100 years, that would be a sea level rise of a foot. If you go back 1,000 years, you're talking about a sea level rise of about 10 feet. So sea level rise has been a important factor in barrier islands, and barrier islands are constantly changing and moving, and they go from Mexico to the New England, around the Gulf Coast and around the coast of Florida and up to New England, and they're a formation that is explained as consolidated sediments of sand that aggregate off the coast, and this is caused by the drift and the currents depositing the sand. There could be some of these islands that there is some land that was that actually was higher, and then the sand formed around land that was here as the sea level rose. There are other places where it can be explained by the mangrove islands forming. The mangroves, when they find shallow areas, they establish themselves, and they put down their roots, and then things get caught under the roots, leaves and other detritus type material, and then that's another way that these barrier islands have formed. So between having remnants of landforms that the islands have formed around, like rock formations, like the Point of Rocks on Siesta Key, that was there, had been there for many years. Also, oyster bars are an active, growing, land-forming way that land is formed. So these barrier islands are something that are interesting to consider in themselves. And if you were to consider the west coast of Florida and Longboat Key 100 years ago, you would have the island about it where it is now. You would go back 1,000 years, the island would have been offshore a little bit because the sea level has risen, and you might have an island that was maybe half a mile offshore. As the sea level has risen, if you went back 1,000 years, you would have the island right offshore, maybe a mile, and then if you went back 10,000 years, you would have the island offshore maybe as far as 30 miles, 40 miles offshore. Basically the same plants and animal types, but the island has moved, and these plants, they all move. The mangroves, they call them the walking trees. They are constantly forming land and moving as the water comes up. So this is my topic for tonight, and I'll use aerial photographs and photographs of the animals that we have here to try to describe what in general has happened with barrier islands. And there's plant communities that we would associate with these barrier islands, and one would be the beach community, and that would be the beach community would be the famous beaches that we have here. And then right upland from the beach community would be the historic dune community. So the historic dune community is the higher land up from the beaches, and then those would be grasses and sea oats and sea grapes and cactus and other plants that adapted to live in that area. And then as you go further up, you get to pine flatwoods, and pine flatwoods are something that we have, lots of examples of up in the mainland, where you have saw palmettos, pine flatwoods, and the animals associated with that. And then as you go further, you would get to the oak hammock, and somewhere in between the pine flatwoods, the oak hammock, and maybe even in the area that has the historic dune area, would be isolated bodies of water that you would call lagoons. And these may be saltwater lagoons, and they may be freshwater lagoons, but these are what I believe are remnants of passes that existed here on the west coast of Florida. And as the passes and the landforms changed, passes were isolated and encapsulated by the land. And at times when they were cut off from the salt water, they became freshwater, either because there were springs or because of rains. And so this is part of what you look at when you look at the barrier island, is the typical beaches, historic dune. Then you have the uplands, which would be pine flatwoods and oak hammock, cedar hammock. And then you would get down to the mangrove forest, and the mangrove forest would be something that the animals would migrate back and forth between all these areas, because some of these islands, they're just thin islands that are sometimes less than 100 yards wide, and sometimes as much as a mile wide. And between these islands and the mainland, there's usually a bay, which can be a shallow bay, which is in some places only couple of hundred yards wide, and in some places it's as wide as a mile. So these barrier islands are interesting, and I'm just trying to go over some of the considerations and touch on the plants and animals that live in these communities. And then it records.